So obviously, there's one position that's going to get the most discussion, but it's not the one we're going to start off today. Quarterback's going to be a big part of this conversation, and it's the topic that everybody talks about. And honestly, if we did a quarterback show every day and I wrote an article about Tyler Buckner every day, we'd get tons of clicks and downloads and views.
Sure.
But the group that I think is most important is the offensive line. And there's three players from the sophomore class that I think are going to be vital to success this year, and two especially that we expect to be starters. And that is obviously your bookend tackles are both true sophomores. Joe Alt at left tackle, and Blake Fisher at right tackle. I also am very curious to see what kind of emergence we see this season from Rocco Spindler. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't add him to the conversation because injuries happen, right? And you've got a veteran left guard who is coming off of an offseason torn pectoral muscle. You've got a 6-year senior at right guard who's a guy that's battled injuries for 3 years now. Your depth is going to be needed at some point in time, or at least you hope so. And does Rocco tap into his full potential and become that guy? That's another question mark to have. But we're going to focus mainly on the two tackles, Ryan. And the reality is if this team is going to be an elite team, the offense has to play like one of the 5 to 6 best offensive lines in the country. It's quite a tall task to ask that of a unit that was not in the top 30 offensive lines last year. And that's being kind, I think. I think that's being relatively kind.
Agree.
Now, we've got some changes. Harry Hiestand has arrived. That instills a great deal of confidence. We've seen him – I mean, look, the reality is his 2015 and 2017 offensive lines were, in my opinion, the best offensive lines in college football in those seasons. And in both years, he relied on young players, right? You had Quentin Nelson starting at left guard as a redshirt freshman, which means he had way less experience than Joe Alt and Blake Fisher did when he started at left guard in 2015. When Quentin Nelson got hurt against USC, they replaced him with Alex Bars, a redshirt freshman who stepped into that spot. Mike McGlinchey was a redshirt sophomore that season, but he had one career start under his belt coming into that campaign. So you had a young group. And then you look at 2017 and your starting right tackle was a redshirt freshman who then would rotate every other series with a true freshman. Now, this is a unit that's going to rely on two true sophomores at tackles. And so those are very, very important roles for them to have. And the reality is this unit has to play, not have to play well, they have to play very well. You can't do that without the tackles, Ryan. And you're talking about young players that are going to be asked to go out in some big moments and play like veterans. And that is the talent is obvious, but the question is going to be, can they get the consistency needed at that position? There's going to be games where Blake Fisher is going to look like a stud. There's going to be games and Joe Alt looks like a future 10-plus year veteran NFL left tackle. The question and what will ultimately determine the success of this unit is, can they get it to be consistently good, where the times they look great are balanced with just good football. What they have to avoid, Ryan, is when it looks great and then when they struggle because of their youth. The latter part is the thing that Notre Dame has to avoid if this offensive line is going to reach its potential, which is built around the tackles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes to the volatility, right, of having a younger player. I mean, consistency is something that people strive for, and that's usually where that experience level comes into effect. And it's very hard because I talked about this a little bit in the intro, but it's very hard to hide a tackle, right? Like you can hide a guard to a degree because you got other size guys around them. They're playing a little bit of decreased space, but offensive tackles, man, they're on an island a lot, right? And we're going to see them tested against some really good pass rushes this year and some good defenses, sporadically throughout the schedule. You're talking about the BYUs, and if Ohio State takes it to the next step, and in Clemson's of the world, like there's going to be some really good defensive linemen that are going to test guys like Joe Alt and Blake Fisher. And it's funny, Brian, I feel like aside from Jared Patterson, those are the two guys that everyone's just kind of counting on, right? Like those are they're going to be good. Yeah, like we don't need to worry about them, right? Like they're going to be studs, and they very well could be, because I mean, why are we excited again? You don't often get guys that are, you don't often get a 6'7", 300-plus pound former tight end turned left tackle that makes a freshman All-American who wasn't even the top offensive tackle in the class. Everyone was expecting Blake Fisher to be that freshman All-American. But then, of course, the injuries happen. We only get a game and a half of them. But I would say in that game, the first game, I thought, it was kind of, easing into it a little bit. But I thought he looked pretty good against Oklahoma State, especially in
Yeah.
pass pro. I thought he did a really good job in that game. You saw the spurts of how good he can be. And if these guys are what we think they are, and they are what we think they are close to their ceilings in 2022, because they're not going to hit their ceilings in 2022. I think that's very unfair to expect. But if they are studs in 2022 and consistent studs, then it's just going to make everything around it so much easier, right? Because you still have Jared Patterson, you still have Josh Lugg that has played good football. Jared Patterson should still be one of the best offensive linemen in college football. But if they are studs, you just need everybody else to be good. So anything other than plus every other spot is just an added bonus. So they are the key to unlocking this overall potential. And everyone asks, like, how long until they get to the Harry Hiestand level? As quick as those guys turn into studs, as quick as they get to the Harry Hiestand level, in my opinion, because they have that type of talent.
The interesting thing, too, you talked about Blake Fisher last year. Blake played a game and a half of football. Somebody asked, is he technically a redshirt freshman? Yeah, he is. He's technically a redshirt freshman. The interesting thing is he didn't exactly have a easy task in his game and a half. That was the interesting thing about Blake's. His first half was a bunch of snaps against Jermaine Johnson, who was the top 25, 26, he was like 26 overall pick or something like that.
26 overall,
in the NFL draft this past year by the Jets. First round draft pick, transfer from Georgia. And I thought Blake held his own in that matchup. It was his first college football game. And then he comes back, and it's like, what's your welcome back to college football moment? You're playing the defense that has had the most sacks in college football last year. And oh, by the way, we're going to throw it 68 times. That's the other thing. And and I thought that him and Joe handled themselves well against an athletic and really well coached offensive line. And you could see what makes them special, Ryan, is there were times when Blake in that Oklahoma State game, you're like, man, that stance has got to get better. Boy, that kick slide's got to get better. Sure. And the technical aspects, like, yeah, that's going on teaching tape, but it's like here's what you can't do type of teaching tape. And it was true for Joe as well. But, Joe came in with a dad that played offensive line in the NFL, a little bit more advanced than Blake from a technical standpoint. But both of them had those issues. But it didn't really hurt them. And here's why. Because they're so big. And that's the thing is, like, there were times when Blake, I'm like, oh, he's about to get beat. I'm sitting there watching the game. I'm like, Blake's about to get beat. And then he would extend his arms like, no, he's good. He's good. Right. Because the getting beat part was more about his first step was not good. And when you're playing, and the reason I say to get beat is I had watched a ton of Oklahoma State film. And when they beat you, when Brock Wright, or was it the Oliver kid? What's his first name? Colin
Oliver and Brock Martin.
Yeah. Right. And so once he would, Oliver was more of a speed guy. He was more of an athletic guy. When he would get you beat on the first step, you were done. And that's why he was so good. And then Brock Martin was a savvy, nuanced, route pass rusher with all these different moves, and he'd get in your pads and all this. And there's times when Blake would kind of come off a little high, and you're like, man, or Joe would come off high, and all of a sudden they'd get their hands out, and it looked like, like the big brother teasing the little brother. You put his hand on his forehead and the little brother's like swinging, but he can't get to you. That's what it was like watching them play at times, where the technique wasn't there, but once they'd extend their hands, it's like they were able to get it, because they're both pretty good athletes. And I think that's the part of Blake's game that people don't appreciate enough. Somebody, one of our customers says, hey, are you worried about Blake Fisher's athleticism due to the fact that he's a little bit knock-kneed? And I'm like, no. I understand the question, because Blake didn't play a whole lot, and you have certain opinions of a guy that's 6'6", 330, right? But I'm like, no, I'm not. I think that's one of the aspects of his game that's very underrated, is he's a really good athlete for that size. And Joe is really technically sound, which can mask, again, his athleticism. This is a kid that played tight end his whole career. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the interesting thing, is this is a really athletic group. And with all due respect to Mike McGlinchey, I think both of them are better athletes laterally than what Mike McGlinchey was. I would say they're more comparable to Ronnie Stanley's. They're more comparable to guys like that as movers than what Mike McGlinchey, because Mike McGlinchey was a vertical force. He was a dynamo coming off the ball, but he could get a little bit lumbering laterally. Because Mike's a really good athlete, but we're talking about a specific type of athleticism. It's the lateral speed.
Long legs, changing direction, redirecting.
He's a very tall, very tall player. It's not a natural thing, where I think Joe and Blake are also really tall, but they're built differently. Mike was long-legged. Mike was almost built more like a power forward than he was an offensive tackle, meaning he was a lot more leg than he is torso. And I think that's kind of where you kind of get a little bit of that. These guys, in my opinion, are very good movers. And I think that's an underrated aspect of this group is they're very long and they're movers, which means they don't necessarily have to have that grown man strength yet. And because that's the other big concern is the experience, but then the grown man strength, the been with Bayless 3, 4, 5 year strength that we're referring to, they can get away without having that because they're so long and they're so big. I saw a picture somebody sent me the other day of the offensive line posed together. Joe Walt looks like he's grown 2 inches. I'm not saying he has. I'm just looking at the picture. I'm like, maybe it's the camera angle, but he's like by far the tallest guy there. And
he's
he
only
just
19.
looks like he's
It's
really
possible,
filled out.
right? Like, yeah.
So it's going to be a really big line. And I think that's something where the combination of technical improvement, length, size, and athleticism because isn't that what you look for, Ryan? Like, okay, what does he not have? He doesn't have experience. Okay, what can we utilize or what will he be able to utilize to overcome something you cannot fix? You can't fix experience with a drill.
Right.
You can only fix experience with, here's novel concept, experience, which means he's got to play. So what are the traits they have to do that? And I think those are the traits you look at and say that they've got those things which can overcome the two concerns, experience and just the time in the weight room.
Yeah, I mean, I call it overcompensating traits. That's what I always kind of like to refer to, right? It's like if a guy, because this is like the arm length comparison. I know we don't have arm length concerns for either one of these players, but it's like if a guy has length concerns, they have to be a really good athlete because you have to kind of overcompensate that lack of ability to work in space, right? Like that's kind of where the overcompensating trait works. For a Blake Fisher and a Joe Welts, the fact that they are both 6'6" plus with long arms and both good athletes, that masks a lot of maybe technical deficiencies that they may have right now. And how do you get better at that, Brian? To your point, Harry Hiestand drawing him a million times, but then also you need the live bullets, man. Like you need to go against Jermaine Johnson, right? You need to go against Miles Murphy. You need to go against these guys because that's how you take that technical refinement. You take it from a understanding but to a practical approach. You need to be able to work it. That's how you develop those good habits on film. So you're absolutely correct. And I mean, it's because I think a lot of people out there, Brian, are probably looking at Blake Fisher like, guys, he's 6'6", 330 and really powerful. He doesn't need to get stronger. But the key is that he is going to get stronger because he might not need to add a single more pound of weight, which is probably true.
Correct.
But he is going to get a whole lot stronger. If you think that he is physically dominant with displacement power now, wait until he has a couple years with Bayless. Because that's when he goes from a really good player to a dominant football player.
To an elite one. Right. Like Quentin Nelson is a perfect example. Quentin was huge. He was 330 plus as a redshirt freshman. He was strong naturally. I mean, look at some of the blocks he had that year. I mean, we could point out some of the one that people like to point out most from that year is the time he came off against Ohio State on a touchdown run, and he goes up just destroys Raekwon McMillan and drives him, just destroys him. But he was stronger in 2017 than he was in 2015, right? And so that's kind of what we're getting to. But it's also about the endurance aspect, the conditioning aspect of it, right? As you get older, you get better in those areas. So those things you look for. But I predict, Ryan, I have a great deal of confidence. I would have been comfortable with this duo without a coaching change, honestly, because we saw it. We saw it in the game. Now, I would have had some issues in the run game because the technical problems that the whole line had, but I would have been confident in the pass game with this duo, even without a coaching change. Okay. Where I think we're going to see a jump from both of them. And this is where the strength is especially important. It's not as much. So it's pointing out about the bowl game. The lack of strength didn't hurt them in the bowl game because they're so long and big and athletic. It is more important in the run game. If they're going to go move against the better ends that they're going to face this year, the better D linemen they're going to face this year, that's where the strength is going to come into play. But more than anything, they need a big jump in technical improvement. And to me, that is where we need to see this team get better. This duo get better is the technical improvement. And that's where the Harry Hiestand influence is going to have its biggest impact, Ryan, is learning how to play the game better because they are naturally long, which helps them from the standpoint of looking at it from a standpoint of pass pro, but in the run game, that length can be a detriment if you don't play with good technique.
Yes.
And that's where the Harry Hiestand impact more than anything is going to have the biggest impact for this duo.
And also, I like in the intro, Brian, that you talked about, it's not just about being consistent against, the UNLVs of the world, right? It's about being against Ohio State, against Clemson. Why is that technical improvement so important? Because those guys can match you with the length and athleticism that you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
All due respect to Brock Martin and Colin Oliver, both really good college players. They're not the longest guys in the world, right? Colin Oliver's got some juice to him, but they're not long guys. So, like to your point, Joe Walt eventually could just kind of go, all right, it's over here, sir. Like, I got a little more to me, a little length to me. But when they're going against Miles Murphy, for instance, from Clemson, even Zach Harrison, even though he's not developed, those guys
he's still incredibly long.
Incredibly. Almost 36-inch arms on Zach Harrison. So those guys can start to outreach you or at least match your reach, right? That's where the technical side comes in. Because even a Zach Harrison that is not as developed as he should be right now, if he gets to your outside shoulder and he gains extension on you, he can beat you, right? Mm-hmm. But if you are a player,
Jack Sawyer's that way, right?
Jack Sawyer, there's a lot of players. I mean, even Tyler Beatty that plays at BYU is one of those players. Like, they're 6'5", 270 with length. Any of those guys, if they outreach you, they can beat you, right? And I think that that's where the technical refinement, when a guy does outreach you, hey, I need to reposition my hands. I need to get back inside positioning. I need to slide a certain direction and redirect in space. That's why it's important, because the better teams on the schedule are going to be able to negate some of your length and athleticism advantages. They're going to be able to. And that's why that technical refinement is very important for these two, because the talent is all there. But if they're also talented and technically sound, then you feel good about pretty much every matchup on the schedule.